The main importance of psi is establishing a solid scientific basis to say the transpersonal should be looked at seriously.
I am able to sense a lot of different dimensions of life, and it's all interconnected. And apparently the rest of the world's not seeing that.
Thoughts are actually faster than the speed of light, and that's worth remembering.
This is useful in the sense of demonstrating to somebody something that's interesting, but it doesn't count as evidence in a scientific sense.
We are in wireless broadcasting with everything around us. Everything is broadcasting, everything is receiving. And once you get that in your consciousness, you'll never feel disconnected or separated again.
When I've asked them these questions about, do you really believe this, they look at me like, what's wrong with you? You can't see it, it's all around you.
But one very well-known scientist came back and said, this is the kind of thing I wouldn't believe in, even if it were true.
We humans are unlimited. And the more we practice something, the better we get.
I've been thinking about this subject ever since I was at university, when I discovered there were other philosophies in life, and not just religions with rules. I've puzzled over metaphysics and esoteric books, dabbled in yoga and meditation. I've been soothed by energy healers, healed by acupuncturists, and had my fortune read. I've never thought too much about psychic phenomena. I don't think I'm any more psychic than the next person. Certainly not as psychic as my cat, who mysteriously knows to disappear just before a vet appointment. Recently, 3 strange events happened around me, all at once. First, there was the story of my daughter.
I had a dream where I was in the house of Tanith's mother, and her mother was lying in her bed, and she was suffering from something, and she was saying, help me, and she was reaching her hand. No one was helping her, and I felt as though I was part of the ceiling, just looking down. I didn't remember the dream when I woke up. I woke up from normal. And it was when we were walking on the beach that we got a call from Tanith that her mother had died that night. I was like totally freaked out, as though I could have seen the future, and I felt as though I could have helped her.
Then, out of the blue, I felt compelled by some strong force to ring my father, only to be told he had had an accident and was in intensive care. Then the third thing happened. I was filming my friend's wedding, and this spoon-bending performer turned up. I watched him like a hawk. He had to be a fraud.
And a little blow.
Then I invited him home to bend my kitchen spoons, and I could observe his tricks a little closer.
Stainless steel.
Stainless steel, wonderful. So it is a stainless steel teaspoon. So if I take it and I rub it between the head and the neck, excuse me, sorry.
I don't know how he did it, but I'm sure it's a sleight of hand. But I know the other two incidents were real. How do I distinguish between tricks and truth? Tell the difference between a psychic and a fraud? I want to know what science has to say about these mysterious matters. I want to know if, how, and why. And is there an explanation or evidence to prove them? California has always had a great tolerance for innovation and new ways of thinking. There are plenty of scientists to talk to, and the one who has agreed to guide me on this journey lives in my old university town of Berkeley. I am on my way to Professor Tart. He is one of the grandfathers of parapsychology, as he has been investigating psychic phenomena for almost half a century.
Good morning, Renee. I didn't expect to be filmed opening the door, but what the heck. Come in. Psychical research, or parapsychology as it morphed into eventually, has been around for roughly 100 and some years. And during that time there have been a few psychic phenomena that have been explored at great length, such that there are hundreds of experiments demonstrating the reality of each of those. There are also some things that simply haven't been investigated that much and that might or might not be real. But the ones that are real, by any reasonable criteria of science, are the ones I call the Big Five. And that's telepathy on the one hand, mind-to-mind communication. Second is clairvoyance, the direct knowledge of the physical world when it's not known to anyone else at that time. The third of the Big Five is precognition, and I must say this is the one I have the most trouble with intellectually because I can't really imagine how it could happen, but the evidence shows that it's happened. The fourth of the Big Five is psychokinesis, or telekinesis, to use an older term, mind over matter. And the fifth is psychic healing. These I call the Big Five simply because there are hundreds of experiments supporting the reality of each one, and they're very rigorous experiments. They're done to much higher standards of control than experiments in almost all other fields of science. Aha. Ah, yes. That's a nice twist. And you can still use it. So I think of the bent spoon stuff as the universe sort of teasing us sometimes as to what's going on here. I much prefer to rely on the laboratory research on mind over matter, where you do have things happen under conditions where you actually know what went on.
Now that Professor Tart is retired from UC Davis, he teaches at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology in Palo Alto.
I got into the spiritual emergency business without knowing I was going to get into it 40-some years ago. And over the years, I have gotten, it must be thousands of phone calls, letters, mostly emails now, from people who've had unusual experiences, and in a lot of cases, they're frightened. They're confused. They don't understand what's happened to them. And I would look at the experiences and I'd say, oh yeah, well that's a telepathic experience and that's an apparition of the dead and so forth, and sort of gave it a name. Trans is talking about breakthroughs or mystical experiences or epiphanies where a person experiences being part of something much bigger than just their ordinary biological and social self.
It's a mirror you can shoot yourself in.
So if someone feels they've contacted God or been at one with the universe or unified with nature or something like that, and it's a real feeling, not just an idea, but a real deep feeling, that's what we mean by a transpersonal experience. They forget their ordinary little self.
Area of lunar highlands called Fra Mauro, then Edgar Mitchell explored its surface.
Hey, you're right. Al's on the surface? No, on the surface. That's Edward, old man.
After the work was done, and I was able to look at the Earth, the Moon, and the Sun as they passed through the cabin window as we were coming home, and I was able to look at the heavens and suddenly realize that the molecules of my body and the molecules in the spacecraft had been manufactured and created and prototyped in some ancient generation of stars. And instead of a intellectual knowledge, it was a visceral knowing and connection, a feeling of connection with the star systems that created us, created the matter in our bodies. And it was accompanied by a very blissful feeling that I'd never experienced before. A life-changing sort of experience, and one that I think, that I've come to realize, is perhaps our evolutionary destiny, provided we survive that long.
Man, we better back off here and think about this one, you. Okay, I'm going to stop here and rest for a minute now. Let's start things heavier than I expected.
In 1974, Edgar Mitchell was the 6th man to walk on the moon. Since his epiphany, he has been dedicating his life to looking for answers to explain what happened to him. He put his money where his mouth was and founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences. Noetic means to reveal a deep and profound truth. Here at the Institute, they investigate science with a spiritual dimension. Professor Tart has offered to be my introduction to a small band of courageous men, the frontier scientists doing the experiments in these fields. This is fortunate, as they were very tentative to meet me. There's a lot of prejudice and a lot of skepticism against psychic or psi research. Some scientists have even lost their jobs over it. Dean Radin is one of the most famous parapsychologists in the U.S. Like Professor Tart, he is a well-published author and has been doing experiments into psychic phenomena for 30-odd years.
Do you think this is a trick?
In this case, it's not. You have to ask, is it possible in principle to do this with force? And the answer is yes. Then the second question is, can somebody dissociate so they're not aware of what they're doing? The answer is yes. So in a case like this, we don't know. When you look at the overall results of experiments on telepathy and on clairvoyance and precognition, and also psychokinesis, you find that the cumulative data is quite strong in favor of the existence of these effects. You also find that the effects are much weaker in what you see in the laboratory than what people typically report in their real life.
My daughter was very young, probably around 2, and we were walking down the street, and I suddenly was confronted by what appeared to be an angel standing in front of me and telling me to go to the other side of the street and to move very quickly. So I picked my daughter up and ran across the street, and then I turned around to look behind me to see what was happening, just as they were trying to lower a grand piano from an upstairs window. And the cable snapped on that piano. It came straight down and crashed. The keys flew right out sideways in both directions.
some of the experiences that people have in life with so-called crisis telepathy and precognition in dreams and that sort of thing, we know that in principle, some of that is real sometimes. But on the basis of any given story, you never know.
Dean is currently investigating precognition, also called presentiment. It is an ability to foresee or foresense the future. It can occur as a vision, a mental flash, or a dream.
Camera follows. Can you see the future? Okay, so let's at this point bring in Oshara's head, and the rest of her body can follow. The experiment involving the eye tracker is looking for presentiment in the eye, essentially. So when the experiment is running, you'll see that Oshara's eye will be here, and it's tracking the eye, and this is what she will see. The movement of the pupil is reflective both of the amount of light that's coming in, but it also reflects your emotional response to what you're looking at. So what we hope to find in this experiment is that when you see an emotional picture, you have a certain big response in your pupil, and when you see a calm picture, you have a response, but it's not so big. That's when you see it. The question is, what happens to your eye before you see it? Now, in the case before you see these pictures, you're always looking at a gray screen. There's nothing there. So you wouldn't expect, by any conventional reason, that the eye would be changing. But the presentiment study suggests that the eye and the body, everything in the body, does change. It is responding to, apparently, your future. Here's a 3-second period before the picture is selected. And what we hope to find is that when there is a big emotional response in the future and causes an emotional dilation, that there would be a similar dilation beforehand, and as you see, that's what ended up with her. This difference in pupil dilation mimics what happens later. So this is a presentiment, this area here. So if the future is very emotional, it may, in a sense, leak backwards in time and affect how you behave now. Most of the evidence in the laboratory comes from the equivalent of college sophomores. They come from people, just ordinary people, who are maybe interested in this, maybe not. I think of this study as looking through the window to the soul to see the future. That's the poetic way of thinking about this study.
It was December, about 15 years ago, when I suddenly got a phone call from Good Morning America, one of the largest morning talk shows here in the United States, and they wanted to book Deepak Chopra for an interview, which normally would have been amazing news, really fantastic. He wasn't yet a household name. The problem is that Deepak had just left a few days before to go on a safari to Africa with his family. And right before he left, he called and he said, I'm going to be completely unreachable for the next 2 weeks. And this was way before email or cell phones, and it just wasn't going to be possible to call him. And the producer said to me, I need to know in 24 hours if he can be on the show on January 2nd. And I was just going crazy thinking, I can't commit him because I don't know his schedule, and I can't say no because it's such a great opportunity. So I just said, okay, I'll call you back in 15 minutes. And I closed my eyes, and inside of my mind, I screamed as loud as I could, Deepak, call me! And 10 seconds later, the phone rang, and it was Deepak, and he said, what do you need? And I said, how did you know? He said, I knew. What do you need? And I told him, and he said, of course I'll do the show, and January 2nd's perfect. I called the producer back, we booked it, and everything worked out.
Telepathy means instant communication between two people, regardless of distance, through means other than the five senses. The person who has done the most research on telepathy, thousands of experiments in the last 30 years, is the British biologist and philosopher Rupert Sheldrake.
And telepathy happens between people who are closely bonded emotionally, or between people and animals, if there's a close emotional bond. It doesn't typically happen between strangers. I've done a lot of experiments on telephone telepathy that show that people really can tell who's calling. In these experiments, the caller names 4 people they know well. They give us their phone numbers. We pick one of the 4 senders. The sender rings them up, the phone rings, and they have to guess before they answer the phone who's calling.
Maureen. Maureen. Yes! Oh, yes! Yes!
By chance, they'd be right one time in 4, at 25%. In our experiments, they're right about 45% of the time. And I now have an automated version of this experiment for emails on the internet and also for SMS messages. So it's now possible to do these experiments on a wide scale using modern technologies. Telepathy works between people who know each other well. The sense of being stared at often happens with strangers, and I think in nature it probably evolved in connection with predator-prey relationships, that if prey animals could tell when predators were looking at them, they'd escape better than if they couldn't tell. And this sense of being stared at is common in animals, it's not just in people. It's a biological phenomenon.
Our conscious awareness is a very thin slice of what we're actually able to perceive. And there's a huge amount of additional perception going on below the surface. So another category of telepathy experiments is whether or not you can feel that someone is paying attention to you. So they're sometimes called remote staring experiments.
And when I think you're looking at me, look at the camera.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. So what I'm going to do now is make sure that we're picking up the physiology okay. We take 2 people and separate them. And instead of having one try to mentally send information to the other, you simply have them look at a closed-circuit video image of them and try to mentally or intend very intently to capture their attention, simply by looking at them. You're just waiting here for an image to come up, and as soon as it comes up, put every ounce of intention that you can have onto her. Look at the screen. Look at us. Okay. So there's the end of the 10 seconds. This is the moment when the TV screen turns on. And so she immediately stops relaxing, starts to become more aroused, and then near the end of it begins to relax again. So this suggests that this kind of response, skin conductance arousal and a restriction in blood flow during that period, if it happens often enough, on average, over the course of the session, then it gives us evidence that she was responding physiologically to our distant intention. So what this tells us is that these psychic connections are probably there all the time. Most of the time they're operating at the level of the unconscious. And it's only fairly rare that it rises to the level of awareness that people can report it. On those occasions, when your senses are turned off or subdued, that's largely where people begin to report these other forms of connections. So meditation, dreaming, drumming, dancing, drugs, lots of things will deflect your ordinary attention and allow you to pay more attention to other things.
The official Oscar magnet. Well, Oscar has a very uncanny ability, and his uncanny ability is that he knows when terminal dementia patients are about to die. Generally, anywhere from 2 to 4 hours before a death, Oscar will wander into a room. He usually will leap onto the bed if he's allowed by the family and stay there. Usually he curls up next to the patient, and he almost serves as an early warning system, so to speak, for us. When we know Oscar is milling around a patient, we know that we need to ramp up our end-of-life services. We know that it might be time to call the family in from home, because he stays until the patient dies.
Many dogs, cats, and other animals pick up their owners' intentions. They seem to be telepathic with their owners. One of the ways in which dogs show this behavior is knowing when their owners are coming home. About 50% of dog owners have found that the dog goes and waits at a door or a window before the person gets home. We've done experiments that show it is really happening. We film the place where the dog waits. We have people go at least 5 miles away. We have them come home at random times. They travel by taxi to avoid familiar car sounds. And the dogs still know. They start waiting when the person decides to go home. So they're responding to the person's intention, and therefore it seems to be a telepathic phenomenon. It's what's going on in the person's mind, not noises or physical clues or anything like that, that's telling the dog when they're coming. I think social groups of animals have morphic fields: termite nests, ants' nests, bees' hives, and flocks of birds and schools of fish do as well. The whole group behaves as if they're a single organism. I think all social animals, including us, have fields for social groups that link the members together within the group and continue to connect them even when they're away from each other, physically separated. The closest physical analogy to telepathy is in quantum physics, quantum non-locality. Quantum non-locality is when two particles have been part of the same system. They're part of the same system, they move apart, and when they move apart they remain linked to each other, or entangled, as quantum physicists say, so that a change in one instantly affects the other. My idea of morphic fields is very similar in spirit to quantum theory. The morphic fields are a bit like quantum fields. They're probability structures. Nature's organized by invisible fields. Living organisms are organized by invisible fields. This seems to be the nature of nature.
Telepathy suggests a form of connection between people. So if two people are really connected, then if you separate them and you poke one of them, the other one should flinch. And one of the more interesting studies of this type that I know of was done by colleagues at Bastyr University and the University of Washington. They selected one couple out of 30 couples, and then they put the person playing the role of a receiver in a functional MRI. This is a brain scanner that's looking at what's happening, the blood flow in your head. And they put the other person at a distance and exposed the sending person to flashing lights or to static lights. And the question was, if these two people are really connected mentally, then when one person's seeing flashing lights, maybe the brain of the other one will light up as well. So they did this experiment, and they found that the receiver's brain was lighting up, and it was lighting up in the visual cortex. This actually, it not only shows that telepathy is real under highly controlled conditions, it tells us a little bit about the nature of what that connection is. It would be very, very unlikely that it's a kind of signal connection, meaning like a radio sending a signal from one place to the other, because the usual form of signaling was excluded. So instead, if two brains are in a sense almost acting like one, it suggests that the connections we're talking about are a holistic connection. And I think that begins to point more towards a quantum connection rather than any form of classical connection.
I was approached by the grandmother of a 9-month-old child that had been taken. There was a divorce situation going on. So they brought me pictures and the baby's teddy bear. And I started, it was kind of difficult because I go through thought patterns. And because he's 9 months old and he's in a car seat, he can't see out the window. So all I can see is the inside of a cab of a truck. And so I would keep track of it over a period of days. And then one morning I got up and I called the officer that I was working with and I said, he's with this lady, and I described what the lady looked like, and they're going to go to a grocery store this morning, and I described what the grocery store looked like and where it was. He figured out who the woman was that I was talking about. It was the sister of the man who had taken the baby. So they spent the morning, all these agents, walking around the grocery store, pretending to shop, waiting for her to show up. And then she showed up. She had the baby with her. And they were trying to figure out what to do when she walked away and left a 9-month-old unattended in a grocery cart. And the agents just swooped down on the cart and rolled it away, and they arrested her as a co-conspirator for kidnapping the baby. If I'm working from crime scene photos, which is the way I prefer to work, then the event itself starts rerunning in my head. It's like a movie that's been very poorly edited. The sound doesn't work very well, and I can get snippets of sound, a little short running sequence, and then there'll be a gap, and it's like watching a poor quality movie. But I've learned how to rerun images many times so that if a police officer asks me a question, I can rerun the image, look at it from an adjusted angle, and get the information they're asking me for. So I am technically doing remote viewing, although most people don't think of it that way.
Remote viewing is the scientific term for clairvoyance, using our sixth sense to get information about a distant place or object.
I was a straightforward laser physicist at Stanford University. I graduated my PhD there, and then I worked on a textbook, graduate-level textbook on quantum electronics and lasers. And there's nothing like writing a textbook on the subject to realize how much you don't know. And one of the things that struck me as I was working on the book was that we have a pretty good quantum description of all kinds of mechanistic, inorganic interactions, but we don't have a quantum theory that even begins to touch on mind or that kind of thing.
Can some strange and as yet unexplained psychic ability help us to see that which is concealed from ordinary vision? Is there something in the human mind that can gather information our normal senses do not know?
In the early 1970s, Hal Puthoff was the director of Stanford University's Research Institute. He was testing psychic phenomena with algae and laser beams, until the psychic Ingo Swann contacted him, offering himself as a test subject.
So I talked to my physics colleagues, and they said, oh, these guys are all frauds and charlatans. You better be careful. You better have a really good experiment. So we started doing some experiments of him seeing remote locations. Anyway, I circulated around the results I was getting from these experiments, and a few days later, the CIA shows up at my doorstep. And they say, have we been looking for you?
From 1972 to 1997, during the Cold War, the CIA funded what was known as the Stargate program to test if remote viewing could be used as an intelligence tool.
The very first, I'm not talking about 1 out of 100, the very first Soviet facility we looked at was over in the Soviet Union. And it turned out our remote viewer, Pat Price in this case, drew a picture of a crane. And he said, I'm lying on my back on top of a 2-story building, and this crane is rolling over my head, and it's so large that a man is only half a wheel height. Well, when he told me that, I thought that was ridiculous. But in fact, it turns out that's exactly what the site was like. I don't know if you can see here, but in fact, that little dot there is a man. And so when we asked him, well, what do you think the site is used for? He said, well, I think it's for some space application. It was only after the Cold War was over and people from our country got to visit the location, we found out that, in fact, this was for a space application.
The old-fashioned theory was that remote viewing had something to do with the brain, sending and receiving electromagnetic brainwaves like a mental radio transmitter.
And so one way to attack that is to do experiments over and longer distances, and we eventually did experiments over continents and didn't see any degradation of the apparent, quote, ESP data. So distance didn't seem to matter, so that seemed to be a strike against the electromagnetic idea, the brainwave idea. We then put people aboard submarines, took them down to the bottom of the ocean. There's enough shielding of electromagnetic waves in seawater, conductive seawater, that should have blocked it out. In fact, the remote viewers said, oh, this is, quote, psychically quiet. I can do better than ever. So the major area that we're looking at actually has to do with the fact that although empty space appears to be empty, quantum physicists know it's not really empty. It's full of what we call quantum fluctuation energy or vacuum energy.
Hal thinks there is a mysterious energy pervading all empty space in the universe, including the cells of our body and our brains. He calls it vacuum energy, or zero-point energy. It might connect us all, in which case it might explain remote viewing.
It's our liquid nitrogen tank. Yeah, the reason it's called zero-point energy is that even if you were to cool the universe all the way down to absolute zero, where all thermal motions get frozen out, this energy still exists. Sometimes experiments led to finding, well, a very famous case was that a Russian plane went down in Zaire. And because it crashed into the jungle, the satellites couldn't find it. So Stansfield Turner, as director of CIA at the time, turned to remote viewers and targeted on, well, where did this plane go down? In fact, we were able to find out and get in there and get the plane before the Russians did. And so this was like a super deal. I mean, this was briefed all the way to Carter in the White House. And we were told, you know, you'll never talk about this. But then one time when President Carter, after he was out of office, was addressing a college group in Georgia, somebody asked him, well, what was one of the more strange things that happened as president, kind of unexpected? And he said, well, you know, once we lost a plane in Zaire and we couldn't find it, and the CIA director turned to remote viewers and they found it. And so that's how the story got out.
Was it just coincidence that former President Carter was on my plane the next day? After more than 2 decades of research and $20 million, the Cold War ended and the CIA program was shut down. But word had gotten out, and today in the U.S., there are thousands of people practicing remote viewing professionally.
In 2003, in November, on the 3rd of November, I asked 47 people who had come to a college workshop that I taught on remote viewing. They asked me, we want to do something important. And so I asked them to describe for me where Saddam Hussein was and what he would look like when he was discovered by a coalition or United States troops, what he would be wearing, who he'd be with, what the place would look like. They each gave me their individual answers, which I then analyzed. They had a consensus view, which was that Saddam Hussein would be discovered in a compound of a couple of houses near the city of Tikrit. They said that there would be a road running in front of the house and a river would be behind it. I did the analysis and I gave all the material over to the director of the university, who had it notarized and put in a sealed envelope and put in a vault, which is where it resides to this day. And then we waited.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
The reconstruction of events as they would transpire on the 13th of December was highly accurate. Here is the drawing that was released by the Pentagon. And again, you see here, they call it the spider hole. There he was down there. Here's the vent pipe. Just exactly the sort of thing that they described.
This is the air vent and a fan, exhaust fan, that had been built into the hole to allow him to remain underground.
Here's the building above, and here's the little hidden place. And he says here he is crouched down here, and here's the vent pipe. He's like in a hidden chamber, it says. Here's another one. And she has drawn this building with this funny little second story and with the big palm trees at either end of the building, the funny little second story. Well, here's the actual building. This was released by the Provisional Authority, that took over Iraq. They said that he would only have 2 or 3 people with him, that he would look like a homeless person, that he would have wild hair and wild salt and pepper beard, dressed in dark clothes, that he would be dispirited and dejected and would put up no resistance, even though he would be armed, and that he would have a large quantity of money.
So you would have a good case to go and find Osama bin Laden?
Well, I suppose one would have a good case if the CIA were soliciting input.
Do you know where Osama bin Laden is?
I'm not answering a question like that on tape. It would get me killed. If I sense something like that, I go to the authorities with that. I don't go publicly with that.
Philosopher and parapsychologist Stephen Schwartz of the Philosophical Research Society in Los Angeles. He is determined to see that psychic archaeology is accepted as a modern scientific discipline. He has researched accounts of psychic investigations.
I am interested in the nature of consciousness. And I got interested in archaeology as one of the ways I do research, partly because so much of archaeology depends on luck. Here's an example. We had a very skeptical archaeology department at the University of Alexandria, and they said, well, we're not going to cooperate with you unless you can find something and we can control it all the way through. And so they wanted to find a buried building in a buried city that had a tile floor. So here's George McMullen and I, and we're out in the middle of the desert. Where would you look? And we have to search I think it was about 1,500 square kilometers. Well, after a while, George made a location, and then we had Hella do the same thing. Then we bring George back in, and we literally say to him, now you remember where we started, off in that big area, put a stake in the ground at the corners of the building. Now think about that. You can't be more than a few inches off. And so then we dug down, and there you see the walls beginning to emerge. He's 28 inches off out of 1,500 square kilometers. Come on, Banger. that there is incontrovertible evidence that people have the capacity to access sense impressions and information that they could not know through the normal sensory channels. And I believe that it is telling us that all consciousness is interdependent and interconnected. Exactly what, for instance, the Buddhists and Hindus and others have been telling us for thousands of years.
What do you think of this?
Oh, that's a good one. A friend of mine was giving these kind of spoon-bending parties. And my little 9-year-old daughter, my eldest daughter, had this, and she came back to me after a few minutes, and she had curled up the bowl.
These other things happened, and I went back to my home, and a healer, a Tibetan healer, was living with me. He said, "You want to see psychokinesis?" And I said, "Well, of course." So he said, "Take off your ring." I took off my ring. He said, "Put it in your hand," and I did. He said, "Hold your hand out." He went that over my hand about 3 times, and that's what my ring looked like after it. Nothing was used. It wasn't even touched. I just held it in my hand, and he passed his hand over it.
Just this morning, I was cleaning up my office and looking at this bent spoon, which was bent at a scientific conference that I was attending. There wasn't anybody there who claimed to be psychic or anything, but funny things happened to occur around this one psychiatrist, and this is stuff that's very hard to bend, okay?
If a 6-year-old girl can bend a spoon at a spoon-bending party, then I needed to find a man who invented these parties.
Well, he had to use some force to get it to twist that way, but it had to be pretty soft for him to be able to do it. So it's partial. It's maybe 90% PK. Welcome to the PK party. Does everybody want to bend tonight? Yeah! We're going to all do this together now. Get a point of concentration above your head. To do anything in PK, you need to do 3 things. The first thing you do is you focus your mind on what you're trying to affect. The second step, you command what you want, what your intention is. And the third step is letting go. When I count to 3, we'll all command it forcefully to bend. 1, 2, 3, bend! 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 Let it go.
I'm very skeptical about any large claims of this type, and I went to something called a PK metal bending party, where people get together to bend metal, and my intention was to see somebody do something that could not be done through the use of ordinary force, by trick or by any other means. And what I was hoping to find was somebody who could take the bowl of a soup spoon and bend it in half. So I knew a woman who was at this party and who had claimed to do things like this in the past. So I sat down within 2 feet of her, watching her carefully, and I was holding a spoon of my own and was mimicking what she was doing, just to get a kinesthetic feel for what was going on.
Buckle!
It's a bird.
Buckle. Buckle. Buckle.
I guess I got to get my brain out of the way.
Absolutely.
So she was trying this for a couple of minutes, and I was watching her intently. And then somebody behind me said, "Look what you did." And they were talking about me, what I had done. What I did is I had bent the bowl of the spoon about 90 degrees over. And I immediately looked at my fingers to see if I had been applying pressure, because it would have left an indentation to do it. And there wasn't any indication of that at all. So someone said, well, bend it all the way. I said, okay. So I just pushed it with one finger, and it just went all the way over. It felt soft like taffy and pinched over, and immediately hardened up, and it's been that way to this day.
Buckle! 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 Go ahead.
I need to do it for people.
No, I'd like to do it for myself.
Yeah. Why is it so quiet? Do it. Now, come on. Do it. Now, come on. Go!
Got my brain out of the way. I don't know. I just all of a sudden I was just in an intuitive feeling, kind of like if you make a jumper on a shot in the basketball court when you're playing a basketball game, something like that. Yeah, the zone, exactly. I used to be able to get there a lot faster.
Did you buckle?
The problem with it from a scientific point of view is it's extremely difficult to capture this under conditions that are controlled well enough so that you can provide evidence to somebody else to show them that it looks like it's real. Because I can't do that with my spoon, and I don't even make the claim of that. I don't expect anybody to believe it, but I have my own experience now where I know I can believe it. So when it comes to the rules of evidence in science, it doesn't have much currency. When it comes to a personal experience, it has a lot of currency.
Psychokinesis, or in short PK, means mind over matter. Can we humans, through the power of our mind's intention, affect anything?
Psychokinesis, the original classical experiments used dice. They were triggered by a professional gambler who came into J.B. Ryan's laboratory at Duke University once and said, you know, I'm a professional gambler and I shoot craps and I make a good living at it, but I read this statistics book recently and I found that I can't possibly make the kind of living I do without cheating. What's happening? And so they tested it and asked him to will certain dice face to come up that would make him win, and he got them more often than chance. And this evolved into a regular testing procedure where eventually machines would throw these dice while people were told, make the sixes come up this time. Okay, thank you. Now make the fives come up this time. And again, people got scores different from chance enough to know that sometimes the mind can reach out and directly affect the state of matter in these rolling dice. Nobody tests with dice nowadays. They use fancy electronic machines, which are even harder to imagine what in the world they could do.
Scientists have created ever more sophisticated methods of measuring chance. First, they built this machine. It takes 9,000 plastic marbles up a conveyor belt and then randomly drops them. Normally, they fall into a bell-shaped curve. So scientists asked everyday people, students and so forth, to mentally will more balls to fall to the left or to fall to the right. And they successfully managed to do so. Then they did the same test with this swinging pendulum. Again, people were able to significantly increase or decrease its swing.
The issue is, what kind of control do we have to know what's going on? So in the laboratory, rather than using spoons, we'll use something more like a system which is extremely sensitive to any type of external force, like the movement of electrons. So here we have a random number generator. You can see it's a fairly simple electrical circuit. It goes through the serial port of a personal computer, and all it's doing is randomly flipping coins about 10,000 a second.
Tests have shown that in some mysterious way, the human mind can influence this little machine to produce more zeros or more ones. and shift it ever so slightly away from its normal random course. If one person can affect a random number generator, scientists then wanted to see what would happen with a group of people.
A lot of people who work in contexts that involve groups, choruses or sports or anything where you need to work with other people, occasionally will report episodes when there seems to be a flow in the group, or the whole group gets into the zone, and it just works better. It works like a single organism. And it feels good, too. And the question is, well, what is that? Did something happen psychologically that connected people, or something else? So one possibility is that the group actually does gel in a way. It's almost as though it becomes a single organism, as though there's a moment in which you have random things that sort of come together into a kind of order. So, late 1997, myself and a few others were talking about these experiments and saying, well, wouldn't it be interesting if we could measure the entire world during large-scale events? This was after the funeral of Princess Diana, which was a worldwide event, and there are many more of these now because of the way the media works. We figured if we had random number generators located around the world running 24 hours a day, that we may find that there's a change in the randomness during periods in which people are paying very close attention to one thing as compared to other times. And so we've now been running this for some years. We've had over 200 events so far. And the odds against chance of the change in randomness that we see is about 1,000,000 to 1.
And so they discovered something amazing. Large group events can mysteriously influence these random number generators, causing them to veer off their usual random course. This is Roger Nelson, who was involved in the earliest mind-over-matter experiments. Based here at Princeton University, it was he who organized his scientist friends into collecting random number generator data from around the world. Thus was born the Global Consciousness Project.
So we have a huge database now that includes events like New Year's every year, when people get millions and millions of people, maybe billions actually, celebrate New Year's.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
And people start counting down. They actually focus all together on this very abstract moment. So what we see in the data, just consider that we've got a wandering data line that's a composite across all the time zones and all of the REGs. The data wander randomly until about 5 minutes before midnight. And then the variability decreases and it minimizes around midnight and then comes back up and becomes normal again. So we have a period of about, I think it's on the order of 10 minutes, around midnight, that looks different from random. And this is consistent enough from year to year that it's significant. And we now have a continuous record of 65, roughly, of these devices producing data from random event generators scattered around the world, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for years. This is a little loud. We'll have to turn it off very quickly. But the size of the bar and the loudness of the sound is an indication of the noise level at the particular instrument. Like here's one in Princeton. There's one in Holland, right here, number 1000. That's a very big deviation. Okay, I'm glad you got one of those. Now, there are all kinds of events. There are tragedies, there are wars start and wars end, and there are religious celebrations of various kinds. And we have found that if there are large numbers, and that means something like many hundreds of thousands in most cases, or millions, who become engaged in the same thing. In other words, they kind of all point the same direction mentally and emotionally, then we register something in our data. Gradually we come to understand that things that provoke or embody or evoke compassion, love, deep feelings of connectedness, the kind of thing that really does represent the interconnection of people, those are the things that produce most reliably big effects in our global consciousness data. This is a memorial to the people from Princeton who were killed on 9/11. There are 13 of them with their names inscribed around there. I love the bell. It has a beautiful sound. These are the names. 13 people. And Princeton is just such a little place. Mostly we're just randomly related to each other. On 9/11 we were not randomly related. We were focused together on something that was shocking, completely unbelievable. It was just such a massive event in our mental, emotional space.
How many other countries lost citizens here? Some think it was just Americans. That's not true. 83 other countries from around the world lost citizens here. I look for the ones who don't understand that Ground Zero looked like that on 9/11.
So here's what the variance did. If you draw a picture of the day of this variance, which should normally just wander as a kind of level trace, we get, starting several hours, about 4 or 5 hours before the first plane hit, there's a huge change where the variance increases tremendously and persistently for 6 or 8 hours, after which it then decreases by a similar amount. So we have a kind of a spike in this variance measure on 9/11 that's actually unique in the history up to that time, and it looks like the system responded almost as if it was really feeling the emotions and somehow responding to the tragedy of the day, as people all over the world were doing. We became one.
Wake up now, grab a map, learn the facts. It's free, it's free, it's free.
But mostly we're just randomly related to each other. On 9/11, that we couldn't do anything but be together.
Say nothing is saying, and get the facts.
There are lots of mysteries in our data. It begins to change about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, and that's 4 or 5 hours before the first plane hit. Dean Radin's work is about presentiment. There are beautiful experiments that show in human beings a few seconds of presentiment before powerful emotional events. So maybe the global consciousness had a presentiment about this tremendous, tragic, or traumatic event in global consciousness. This is purely what people call hand-waving speculation, but I think that it may be possible each of us has what you might call a consciousness field, is that our minds are not confined to our heads, they extend out into the world. Our consciousness fields, if there is such a thing, could be a source for the information that could be absorbed, could affect an REG and change its behavior if we come together as a global mind. Effects we're talking about are not really going to be useful for trying to open your garage door or change your television channel. but the implications are powerful. We are connected, not only with each other, but with the environment that we live in. David Bohm, who's a highly respected physicist, who talked about the implicate order and a kind of different way of looking at quantum mechanics, he spoke of a special kind of information. He says this special kind of information is virtual normally, but it's universal. It's extended indefinitely in time and space. It's what people call non-local information. And we think that is the same kind of information that is responsible for the interconnection of human beings or of us with our environment. The same kind of information that makes a difference to the REGs, you know? So anyway, this active information can be actualized, can become real in the world if there's a need for it. So an example that's pretty easy for most people to accept is healing. The healer has the information, the healee needs it, and the two create a kind of opportunity.
Via a friend, I heard about a woman who was miraculously cured through a psychic healing in Brazil.
I was very ill. I'd had 3 bowel resection operations that had failed, and I ended up with a leaking bowel, which affected me very badly in the fact that I had a lot of toxins in my system. I had a lot of skin problems, open sores all over, and I was desperate. I was absolutely desperate. I heard of John of God in Brazil, and I went over there.
And 7 months after her return, she was completely cured.
My liver was completely healed. The cells had regenerated. My colon was functioning for the first time in my life.
I heard so much about it, and when this patient of mine came back, I thought I'd really like to see what's going on.
John of God works for free. He says he is a spirit medium. He goes into a trance and spirit entities work through him to enable him to operate on his patients.
He's very open to medical people or doctors watching close up what he does, and they actually ask if there's a doctor in the audience anywhere. So it was myself and a lady from Germany, and I filmed some of the surgeries from close up from, say, 1 meter away. In the 20-odd years that he's been working in the Casa, he works with his bare hands, and he uses a knife like an ordinary kitchen knife that's definitely not sterile. He hasn't had 1 case of infection, not 1. I haven't heard anybody scream, so there's no pain or relatively very little discomfort. The surgery that he does up the nose with a forceps, a long forceps, it goes right to the back of the sinus. And he would twist the forceps around, and he would actually pull out a tumor. Yeah, I don't know how to explain that. That you don't cause tremendous damage is beyond any belief.
I know this is a controversial issue, but would you send a patient to a psychic healer?
Well, when the patient's being told by the specialist that there's nothing more they can do for him or her, then I feel I can actually suggest something like that. You know, it's not important to me exactly how it happens or why it happens or to find intellectual explanations, because you won't. Anything that you do that will bring about healing that's not harmful, I will support.
Throughout the history of mankind, many spiritual healing methods have been based on the transference of a universal, all-pervading energy. The Chinese call it qi, the Japanese ki, and the Indians call it prana. They say this life force runs deep in our bodies through invisible lines called meridians. In China, they practice Qigong. They say this works the life force energy, promotes health, and prevents disease. The Chinese say illness occurs when there's a blockage of energy. Here at a hospital in China, students use Qigong to make a cancerous tumor disappear. The Chinese are not too caught up in theories about how Qigong healing might work. They say the intellect can't understand how it works. More importantly than how it works is what it does. But in Western science, we don't think like that. We want to analyze and prove these mysterious things. At the University of Arizona, Professor Gary Schwartz and his team are doing scientific research into consciousness and healing.
I began as an electrical engineer, and I understand how literally our anatomy, we serve as an antenna for electromagnetic signals, and we also generate electromagnetic signals. And once you think of the body in terms of electronics and electromagnetic fields and resonance and interaction, the whole idea of energy healing becomes completely plausible.
After my breast cancer surgery, when I had a lumpectomy and some lymph nodes removed, and I was in so much pain, I thought at the time I'd never known pain like that in my entire life. And they had given me tons of morphine, tons of every kind of drug. I'm allergic to all kinds of medicines, and nothing was touching it. And Rebecca showed up, and I don't believe you left for 2 hours, did you? You were there for 2 hours, weren't you?
About that, yeah.
Yeah. So.
But within 5 minutes, with therapeutic touch, we were able to get her pain level to nothing. We're not doing the healing, but we are facilitating it. We're the conduits. Generally, it's just universal energy, and the way that it is for me is I draw the energy through my crown, filling my body with this calm sense of peace, love, coming from a place of compassion. The energy, the hands and heart are connected. The energy then flows through the heart, through the hands, to the individual.
We have electromagnetic signals running between our brains and our bodies that circulate through the liquids in our bodies. Right? Turns out that the blood, for example, is a very good conductor of electricity. And that's why, for example, the energy from the heart, literally the electrical energy from the heart, or the EKG, can be picked up from any part of the body, because the electrical signal from the heart goes down to the toes, to the top of the head. By the way, it's the same thing with the brain. The brain generates an EEG. That EEG signal travels throughout the bloodstream, and you can easily measure that.
Professor Schwartz found evidence that healers emit highly ordered, invisible light waves and produce an extra surge of electrostatic energy.
This is an AC Gauss meter. AC Gauss meters are an extremely standard piece of equipment. And in particular, we're looking at a thing called the universal chi point. And the universal chi point is about here in the hand. That chi point was actually well understood in Chinese medicine. There is an equivalent, for example, in Ayurveda. There are equivalents in many of the, for example, the ancient Celtic traditions of laying on of hands healing. So that point in esoteric knowledge is well recognized and understood.
In our laboratory, we have done many different kinds of experiments. We've measured the effects of energy healing on E. coli bacteria in test tubes. We've looked at the effects of energy healing, such as Reiki, on rats that were stressed with noise and actually measuring the microvascular changes in their gut.
We've known for years now that the power of belief is very strong in healing. Tests with placebo medicines have shown that 33% of all people are healed because they believe they will be. However, these tests, with Reiki on rats, prove the point that belief aside, Reiki works, because who knows what rats believe?
We've done experiments on the effects of healing on the longevity of leaves that have been cut.
Please do not work on the control leaf at any time in this process, no matter how it feels inside. I need you to hold that very cleanly. This is a complete trial that's ongoing at this point. Leaves that are at day 58 in the ongoing process. They have received 4 10-minute healings every 24 hours. You'll notice there are a number of control pots that no longer have leaves in them. We did, in this particular trial, we had 1 practitioner drop out. The other 9 pairs, all of the leaves are still alive.
We didn't know how long this process would last, and today is day 58 of this particular trial, and my leaf is still alive at day 58. My control leaf is no longer with us.
Every time I go up, I go like this, and they ask me why I'm doing this, because I'm Jewish, and I say it's too difficult to do this all the time. So, let's move on from that. We'll come back. Okay, what do we do? Are we reaching the bottom of the bucket here? Or is it about to stop? Go ahead. Show me.
Let's see. I can bring this arm all the way to here, but I can't
I see what you mean. Well, let's play with that. You want to do that?
Okay.
Come on. We got nothing to lose.
Okay. This is from scar tissue.
All right, come around this way if you want, or that way, or any way you want. Now, I'm moving my hands around a little bit just to find where I feel it the most. And then I sort of pull out a little because that helps me. I can feel it a little bit more. And I go, all right, that spot makes the fingers move a little bit.
I listen, I feel, I bring my hands in until I get a sense of something. I feel it, I refine it into the center of my palm. Maybe I pull out, feel the interesting sensation of the draw or the stretching against from the inside of the palm and back. And I simply play with it, and I observe how the people's bodies respond as I feel. There's a beautiful confluence of the energies, or more than the energies, of the frequencies and beyond that come together and create something more. It's more than being just a conduit. We're actually a catalyst for change.
This arm goes up over your head again, do the elbow, keep happening. Reach over.
And in all these different areas and preparations, we find evidence for the power of intention. And the focusing of one's attention with that intention seems to be an important parameter in terms of determining the magnitude of the effects that are obtained.
Sure. I want to see the other one. It's actually looser than the other one.
We've done experiments on the effects of distant healing on the biophoton release or inhibition that occurs in plants. It turns out that all living things generate invisible light that is invisible to the naked eye. And it turns out that a healer can actually affect or increase or decrease the amount of light that's taking place.
You take the leaves home? Or?
No, the leaves stay here and I go home. And then I spend the next X number of days running the energy for 10 minutes 4 times a day.
We just completed an experiment where a group of 400 plus people in London saw one of two leaves in Tucson. We did not know which leaf was picked. Each leaf, geranium leaf, had 16 holes in it, 16 spots where the intention to glow might enhance it. And then for 10 minutes, one of those two leaves were picked, and they watched on the screen the leaf and sent glowing instructions to the leaf. And then when we analyzed the data, much to my great surprise, not only was the leaf that was picked for the glowing instructions, could you see literally the spots where the injuries occurred were literally glowing more. You could see it with the naked eye and between the two images that there was an effect.
This is a photograph of photonic emissions from a human fingertip. Light is present in plants and all beings. It is a source of energy. When we eat, we take in tiny light particles called photons. We store these photons in the cells of our bodies. Photons are quantum particles of light. They collide, exchange information, bounce apart, and stay mysteriously connected at a distance. In quantum physics, this is called entanglement. I wonder, is this how healing and distant healing works?
I would say that when you look at the totality of our research combined with other people's research, the conclusion is quite clear that healing can occur at a distance, that consciousness can have effects at a distance. How that works and the conditions under that works, that's another question. Many universities are skeptical of this kind of work, and there are many faculty within my own university that are skeptical of this research. However, the fact is that this work is funded by NIH, the National Institutes of Health. It's published in peer-reviewed journals. The studies are very carefully conducted, and the findings are very robust. They are real. What I find fantastic is just with, quote, normal energies, just normal radio electromagnetics and normal light frequencies, we've got more than enough power to be able to communicate from one side of the planet to the other, and to be able to do so, quote, virtually instantaneously. So just working within, quote, conventional physics, and then add quantum physics, you've already got all kinds of power for virtually every psychic phenomenon that's ever been reported.
I am on my way to Dr. Larry Dossi, who comes from a traditional Western medicine background. However, he has become internationally renowned for advocating the role of spirituality in healthcare. He lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico.
I was in Vietnam as a battalion surgeon in 1968 and 1969, and was out in the front lines, and saw a good deal of combat experience and a lot of blood and gore as a battalion surgeon. And so I was awarded medals for my participation as a surgeon in that conflict. Beginning in my first year of medical practice, I saw a particular case which changed my way of thinking about these things. I had a patient who was elderly. He had lung cancer in both lungs. He was dying. He did not want any treatment, and at that time there was no good treatment anyway. All he wanted to do was to go home from the hospital, to die at home. The only treatment he had, if you can consider it therapy, is that people from his church came to his bedside day after day and prayed for him. So I sent him home as he wanted to do, and I was convinced that he would be dead in a couple of days. A year later, I couldn't believe he was still alive. I went down to the radiology department, looked at his new chest x-ray, put it alongside the old one, which had lung cancer throughout, but the new one was normal. The only therapy this man had had, if you consider it that, was prayer. And I was astonished by that. I, at that point in my life, was not ready to accept that prayer did anything. I just called it a spontaneous remission and let it go at that. But that was seared into my brain, and I couldn't forget it. And years later, when the studies came out supporting prayer, I thought back about that and began to ask questions about that. I began to look at surveys of patients whose diseases simply went away. And one of the questions that these patients were asked was, what do you think accounted for the disappearance of your illness? Most of these people would say, well, it had something to do with my thought, the way I chose to live my life. Most of them would list some sort of spiritual practice, such as prayer. 75% say that prayer accounted for why they got well. But others would list things like music, doing mental imagery. It's almost embarrassing about the variety of things people describe. Skeptics say there is no evidence. This is profoundly wrong. Currently, there are about 21 major, what we call randomized, double-blind, controlled studies looking at the role of healing intentions, or prayer, if you will. People call this by different terms. Obviously, in the Western world, most people associate prayer with a religion and with a deity. But this is not true if you look at other spiritual traditions around the world. Built in the early 1800s, the Santuario de Chimayo. It's about 30 miles north of here. People attribute all sorts of healing powers to not the water, as at Lourdes, but to the dirt outside this little church. So people go and they get the dirt and they rub it over the area of the body that needs healing. I was at the little church one day, and a woman came in, an elderly Hispanic woman. We struck up a conversation, and she told me how years before she had come there in a wheelchair, and she prayed to the Virgin of Guadalupe, and something happened, and she was able to get out of her wheelchair and walk away. So she left her wheelchair there in gratitude, like people leave crutches at Lourdes and so on. And so she made an annual pilgrimage every year to express gratitude for her healing. She just took it as a matter of fact. She wasn't surprised. Many people here who have fantastic faith in the Virgin think that this just sort of goes with the territory. Actually, the prevalent idea is that good doctors, scientifically oriented doctors, don't believe any of this. That happens to be a false picture. We know that because of surveys that have been recently done. The best one came 3 years ago, and it looked at over 1,000 physicians around the United States, asking them their beliefs about prayer, remote healing, and so on. 75% of these physicians said that they believe that spiritual beliefs can help people get well. 74% said that they think prayer can work at a distance, and 55% said they had actually seen results in their own patients that resembled what they call miracles. This is not the picture people have of doctors. Here's the explanatory factor here. If you ask doctors publicly what they believe, they will just deny that this stuff is real. But if you ask them anonymously on surveys where they do not have to sign their name, you get a completely different picture. These are some benches I crafted for meditation and sitting circle. I live in a part of the world where the Native American tradition is quite strong in northern New Mexico. And I've had the opportunity to talk with many Native American healers and shamans about what they think about prayer and intentionality. And it's taken for granted in their tradition that these things are real. They think it quite odd that we have lost touch with this. One shaman I asked in the area where I live whether or not she believed in prayer. She said, "Oh, don't ask me that. We don't even have a word for prayer. It's just in the air. We don't make anything special out of it. You white people want to fancify this and make something really special out of prayer. It's just the way the world works." We know in modern medicine that many things work, although we don't have an understanding of how. A classic example is the general anesthetics. We don't know how anesthesia really works, but we know that it does, so we use it in spite of our ignorance about how it happens. We're at pretty much the same juncture with healing from a distance, although there are around 20 major hypotheses about how it works. There's no consensus. But almost all of these hypotheses suggest we're going to have to redefine consciousness. We're going to have to free it from the brain, from the body, and distribute it, what I call non-locally, out there in the world. I know people get troubled by the way we use the term consciousness because it's not properly defined. Because sometimes in science you have to allow a term to float in ambiguity, and you understand its meaning as you go along, and you study how it manifests in the world. Then you eventually can define it. That's where we are with consciousness.
This is where you could say I keep all my attachments. All those things I probably don't really need, but I keep thinking I'd need them someday. By and large, science and spirituality, when they come together at all, are kind of dancing around each other and not directly facing the core issue. And the core issue is that most scientists are totally married to an absolute materialist philosophy of mind, which says the mind is nothing but chemical and electrical activity in the brain. It doesn't reach out beyond your body. It dies when you die. That's why I think it's so important to bring Psi in, okay? If materialism is right and the core basis of spirituality is nonsense, the two are never going to help each other. It's going to be a continual fight. But if, as I see it, that when you apply essential science and you discover these psi phenomena and you find that the mind can reach beyond the body, that perhaps it survives death in some form, that we can have interconnections that are extremely deep and pervasive, that's much more what genuine spirituality is about. That's where the marriage between science and spirituality needs to take place. I'm trying to build bridges between those people.
Spoon bending is a very interesting phenomenon. Because first of all, there are a lot of people who just do it as a trick. So, but let's eliminate the tricksters. Let's eliminate the charlatans. And let's talk about the conditions where a person can, for example, very gently stroke. No force whatsoever, just a gentle stroking. And it will be observed to bend. Okay? And the question is, how does that happen? Well, if we remember that any object is 99.9% empty space. This is mostly empty space, as is this. Okay? And what preserves this space is a particular lattice or structure that is held. But since this structure is mostly thin air, with the right intention and the right resonance, it is possible to then, so to speak, commune with the atoms, and therefore get into its resonance so that very little, quote, power allows for it to become, if you would, more liquid or more malleable. And you can do this with some objects more easily than others. But it becomes completely plausible once you look at this as a quantum physics phenomenon.
I know enough about physics to know how little I know about physics. And so I know that a lot of the popular New Age writings that invoke quantum physics as sort of a rationale for psychic and spiritual things, they're really being poetic. I mean, it's kind of beautiful in a way, but quantum physics is not poetry. Our search for truth, are we really going anywhere, or are we just walking on a treadmill?
In looking for mechanisms for how the psi operates, I can speculate, but it'd be too strong a statement to say that I think it's specifically linked to, say, zero-point energy or vacuum fluctuations. But it's still too early to really understand. I mean, even now, we know that dark energy is some 70+% of the universe. Dark matter appears to be some 20+% of the universe. You add it all up, it turns out that 4% of the universe we understand, 96% of the universe we don't have a clue. So facing into that kind of reality, one must be very cautious about saying something can't be.
Imagine that there was no Moses, no Buddha, no Jesus, no Muhammad. Imagine there was no Old Testament, no Kabbalah, no New Testament, no Koran. Imagine there were no seers, no prophets, no medicine women or men. There was just 21st century science. Would science on its own, in its attempt to understand the origin and evolution of order in the universe, including us in our personal lives, would it come to the conclusion that some sort of a guiding, organizing, designing process, some sort of a GOD, existed? And the conclusion that I've come to over 20 years of research, beginning at Yale and continuing at the University of Arizona, is that the answer is yes. And so to be truly comprehensive about what a creative intelligence would mean, it would have to be big enough to encompass quantum physics and Newtonian physics and string theory and all the physics that would subsequently come along.
We're into mystery and the unknown, and so to symbolize that, I stenciled one of my favorite sayings: something unknown is doing we don't know what. This is Sir Arthur Eddington's comment about the uncertainty principle in modern physics, but I love this comment so much I apply it to all areas of life. It's my favorite explanation for everything.
Morphic or zero-point fields, quantum processes in our brain, spirit, consciousness. Universal energy, G-O-D. It seems that our psychic connections are part of a great, mysterious mix of energy and information that lies at the heart of nature. Whatever the budding theories on psychic phenomena, I may not have found a proper explanation, but that does not mean we don't have these powers. Most of the pioneering scientists I met challenged the prevailing materialistic worldview that our mind is just limited to our brain. Their research demonstrates that sometimes there is an aspect of our consciousness that transcends space and time, that transcends the limits of our physical senses, that we can influence our physical world, and that we are mysteriously interconnected.
Yes, we can.
This journey, prompted by my daughter's dream, my father's accident, and the weird spoon bending, brought me to a point where I can confidently say that I have not been deluding myself. The paranormal actually seems normal. But still I wonder, did I, in the process, just find scientific evidence for our divinity, or for spirit?
Okay, well, if the mind can sometimes reach out to another mind, tell about the state of the world at a distance, foresee the future, have a direct influence on matter through psychokinesis, or heal things, to me that sounds a lot like the ideas of a spirit. Now, that doesn't mean that the Catholics are completely right, or the Baptists are completely right, or the Buddhists or something like that, but it does mean there's a reality behind spiritual systems that very much deserves our attention. That's the importance of psychic phenomena and the Big Five.
What the remote viewer experiences is, I believe, exactly what the religious ecstatic experiences at the moment of epiphany, and it is what the genius experiences at the aha moment of creativity.
What the science does, and rather than taking you away from spirituality, it takes you towards spirituality.
And the results show that our intentions matter. What we want actually makes the world a little different from what it would be.
It's as though each of our minds encompasses the entire universe all the time.
Like a hologram, this intelligence is expressed everywhere. The phrase that I like to use is that the all is in the small.
With hindsight, we could say, oh, those are the vectors that probably cause people to pursue various religious traditions or meditation practices or whatever, because it's a real phenomenon in the real world.
Living organisms are organized by invisible fields. This seems to be the nature of nature.
You know, if we have a quality of our consciousness that's non-local or infinite in space, capable of reaching out through not just space but time as well, that sounds pretty much like the soul to me.
Call me.
I'm not answering a question like that on tape. It would get me killed.